Bradford Ellery had lived on Chestnut Ridge Lane for 22 years, and in all that time he had never once been wrong about a neighbor. At least, that was what he told his wife every single morning over coffee, staring out the kitchen window at the rusted, faded, unapologetically ugly pickup truck parked in the driveway 3 houses down. He was about to be wrong in a way that would follow him for the rest of his life. Roy Sutton didn't know, that particular October morning, that the man watching him through a set of expensive kitchen blinds had already decided everything there was to know about him. Roy just knew his truck wouldn't start on the first try, same as most mornings, and that his daughter Lily was going to be late for the bus again if he didn't get that engine turning over in the next 4 minutes. Roy Sutton was 51 years old, broad-shouldered in the particular way men get from decades of manual work rather than gym memberships, with hands permanently stained along the knuckles from oil and solder and 40 years of fixing things other people had given up on. He worked as a locksmith, ran a small shop downtown called Sutton's Lock and Key that had been his father's before him, and he lived alone with his daughter Lily in the smallest house on a street that had, over the past decade, filled up almost entirely with the kind of houses that had circular driveways and outdoor kitchens. He had bought that little house 11 years earlier, back when Chestnut Ridge Lane was a modest, unremarkable street full of modest, unremarkable families. Long before the developers discovered the good school district 3 miles east and decided the whole neighborhood needed reinventing. Roy had watched it change slowly around him, house by house, until his was one of the last left that hadn't been torn down and rebuilt into something with a name like the Whitmore Estate carved into a stone sign out front. Roy had grown up 2 towns over, in a house not much bigger than the one he lived in now, the only son of a locksmith named Earl Sutton, who had taught him everything he knew about tumblers and pins and the particular satisfaction of fixing something other people had already written off as broken beyond saving. Earl had also owned the truck, bought it new in 1978 with money saved over 3 years of double shifts, and had driven it to the shop every single morning for 30 years, without fail, rain or shine, engine trouble or not. Because Earl Sutton believed a man who couldn't be bothered to keep his own truck running had no business telling other people he could fix their locks. Roy had joined the army at 19, mostly because his father had served before him, and mostly because the alternative, staying in that same small town working the same small shop his whole life, had felt at the time like a door he wasn't ready to walk through yet. He'd spent 14 years in uniform, rising through the ranks the slow, steady way career soldiers do, earning a reputation among the men under him as someone who never raised his voice and never needed to. Because Roy Sutton had a way of being calm that made everyone around him calmer too. A trait that had saved more lives over the years than any single medal could ever properly account for. He'd met his wife, Marianne, during a brief stateside, posting between deployments, a nurse with a laugh that filled up whatever room she was standing in, and they'd married 18 months later in a small ceremony neither of their families could really afford, but insisted on throwing anyway. Marianne had been the one who convinced Roy, eventually, that 14 years was enough, that a family needed a father who came home every night instead of one who came home between deployments, and Roy had listened to her the way he'd learned to listen to the people who loved him best. Which was to say, eventually. And completely. He came home for good the year Lily was born, moved back to the town he'd grown up near, took over his father's shop when Earl's hands finally got too arthritic to manage the finer lockwork, and inherited the truck the same year, parking it in the driveway of the little house on Chestnut Ridge Lane that he and Marianne had bought with almost every cent of their combined savings. Marianne passed 4 years later, an aggressive infection that moved through her system faster than any of the doctors expected, faster than Roy's mind could properly process even now. 6 years on, on the nights he let himself think about it at all. Lily had been 6 years old, too young to hold on to more than fragments of memory of her mother, the smell of a particular lotion, the sound of a laugh Roy sometimes heard echoes of in his daughter's own laughter now, a handful of songs Marianne used to hum while cooking that Roy still couldn't listen to on the radio without his chest tightening. He raised Lily alone after that, the way a man raises a daughter when there is simply no other option available, learning as he went. Making mistakes he still occasionally apologized to her for years later, and building, slowly, a life on Chestnut Ridge Lane that was modest and quiet and, in Roy's own estimation, entirely sufficient. His truck was a 1978 Ford. The same truck his father had driven, the same truck Roy had learned to change his own oil on at age 14 in the driveway of the house he grew up in 2 towns over. It had more rust than paint along the wheel wells, a dent in the tailgate from an incident Roy didn't like to discuss involving a runaway shopping cart, and an engine that Roy had rebuilt with his own 2 hands not once, but 3 separate times over the years, each time out of stubbornness rather than any real financial need to keep the thing running. He could have afforded something newer. He simply didn't want to. That truck had carried his father to work for 30 years and had carried Roy's late wife home from the hospital the day Lily was born, and a man does not trade away a truck with that kind of history just because the neighbors think it's an eyesore. Most mornings on Chestnut Ridge Lane followed a rhythm Roy had built out of necessity and, over time, come to genuinely love. He was up at 5:30, coffee in a dented steel thermos his father had once carried to the shop, standing over the stove, making eggs the same simple way every single day, because Lily had informed him at age 7 that fancy eggs, anything involving cheese or vegetables hidden inside, were, in her words, a violation of trust, and Roy had taken the ruling seriously ever since. He packed her lunch the night before, always, because mornings moved too fast for anything that could be handled the evening prior, and he had a small running joke with Lily about the exact placement of her sandwich crusts, which she insisted on cutting off herself with a butter knife each morning in a ritual that took considerably longer than Roy felt it needed to, but that he never once rushed her through. Lily had her mother's habit, one Roy noticed more each year, of narrating her own thoughts out loud without quite meaning to. Entire one-sided conversations happening at the breakfast table about which of her classmates had said what to whom, which teacher had assigned an unreasonable amount of homework, and, with increasing frequency that particular fall, which houses on the street had gotten new landscaping and which ones, in her considered 10-year-old opinion, looked like they were trying too hard. The truck itself had a personality Roy had come to know as well as he knew his own moods. It complained on cold mornings, turning over twice, sometimes 3 times, before catching, a habit that had cost Roy exactly one memorable morning of missing the school bus entirely and driving Lily himself. Both of them still in pajama bottoms under their coats, laughing the whole way because there wasn't much else to do about it at that point. It rattled faintly over 50 miles an hour in a way Roy had diagnosed a dozen times and never quite fixed, because, if he was honest with himself, he'd grown fond of the rattle the same way a person grows fond of an old dog's snore. And the neighbors, one neighbor in particular, very much thought it was an eyesore. Bradford Ellery was 63, a retired investment banker who had made a great deal of money doing something with mergers that he explained at length to anyone who asked and most people who didn't, and who had appointed himself, entirely without election, the unofficial standards enforcer of Chestnut Ridge Lane. He served as president of the Homeowners Association, a role he took with the gravity most men reserve for actual elected office, and he had, over the 11 years Roy had lived on the street, sent no fewer than 14 formal written notices regarding what the HOA bylaws referred to as non-conforming vehicles visible from the roadway. The very first notice had arrived barely 2 months after Roy moved in. Back when Lily was still small enough to ride on Roy's shoulders to check the mailbox. A crisp-typed letter on HOA letterhead informing Mr. Sutton that his vehicle did not meet the aesthetic continuity standards the association had recently adopted. Standards that, as it happened, Bradford himself had proposed and pushed through committee the same month Roy's truck first appeared in the driveway. Roy, new to the street and eager not to make waves, had actually looked into what it would cost to store the truck elsewhere before deciding, with a shrug, that he wasn't going to pay a monthly storage fee to hide his own father's truck from a stranger's opinion, and he'd simply filed the letter away and gone on with his life. The notices continued at a steady clip over the years that followed a spring notice about excessive visible wear, a summer notice suggesting the truck be repainted in a neutral tone consistent with neighborhood character, a particularly memorable autumn notice, 5 years in, proposing that the HO fund a vehicle modernization incentive that Roy quickly realized was aimed at exactly one household on the entire street. He'd attended enough meetings by then to recognize Bradford's pattern, the practiced reasonableness of his tone, the way he always managed to frame his complaints as concern for shared property values rather than personal distaste. Though everyone in the room, including Bradford himself if he'd ever been honest about it, understood the difference was mostly cosmetic. Diane Ellery, a patient woman who had spent 36 years of marriage gently absorbing Bradford's opinions the way a good rug absorbs spilled wine, usually just murmured something non-committal and changed the subject. Because she had long ago learned that agreeing with Bradford about the truck only extended the conversation, and disagreeing extended it considerably further. Privately, on the rare occasions Diane found herself alone, with Roy waiting at the same bus stop corner some mornings, or standing near each other at a neighborhood cleanup day she'd offered small, quiet apologies for her husband's persistence that Roy had always waved off good-naturedly. Because he genuinely bore Bradford no active ill will, the man's opinions costing Roy considerably less sleep than Bradford likely assumed. That truck, Bradford liked to say, usually to his wife Diane over their morning coffee, sometimes to whichever unfortunate neighbor happened to be within earshot at a block gathering, is exactly the kind of thing that drags down property values for everyone on this street. I don't understand why the man doesn't simply buy something respectable. Roy, for his part, was aware of exactly how Bradford Ellery felt about him. In the specific and unmistakable way a man becomes aware of weather he can't change, and has stopped checking the forecast for. He'd received the notices, he'd read them, folded them neatly, and filed them in a kitchen drawer that had become, over a decade, something like a small museum of Bradford Ellery's opinions about his life. He didn't argue. He'd learned a long time ago, in places far harder than a suburban cul-de-sac, that some battles simply weren't worth the breath it took to fight them. And a rich man's opinion about an old truck was about as low on Roy's list of concerns as a concern could get. Down at Sutton's Lock and Key, none of this touched Roy at all. His shop sat on a quiet stretch of Main Street, between a hardware store and a bakery that had been there almost as long as his father's shop had. And the people who came through his door treated him with a kind of easy respect that had nothing to do with what he drove or where he parked it. Old Mrs. Fenwick brought him a jar of her peach preserves every autumn because Roy had once stayed 40 minutes past closing to help her get back into her own house after a lockout, refusing to charge her the emergency rate because she was on a fixed income and he simply couldn't bring himself to do it. A young single mother named Priya Anand, new to town that year, had come in nearly in tears over a broken car key fob she couldn't afford to replace at the dealership, and Roy had quietly rekeyed the whole system for 1/3 of the price and thrown in a spare, waving off her thanks the same easy way he waved off most thanks. His employee, a lanky 22-year-old named Desmond, who was saving up for trade school, liked to tell customers, half joking, that working for Roy Sutton had taught him more about being a decent man than 4 years of high school ever had, and Roy always changed the subject fast whenever Desmond said things like that within earshot. Uncomfortable, as he generally was, with any version of himself that sounded like praise. What did bother him, quietly, in a place he tried not to let show, was the effect all the trouble on Chestnut Ridge Lane had on his daughter. Lily Sutton was 10 years old, sharp-eyed and stubborn in the specific way of a girl who had lost her mother young and learned early that the world didn't always play fair, and she had come home from school more than once over the past year, with her chin tucked low and her voice small, describing the way certain kids whose parents lived in the houses with circular driveways made comments about that junker parked outside her house. Comments that had clearly, at some point, trickled down from parents' dinner table conversations into their children's playground vocabulary. They said Dad's truck looks like it belongs in a junkyard, Lily told him one evening in September, picking at her dinner instead of eating it, the specific posture of a kid carrying something she didn't quite know how to put down. Madison Ellery said her grandpa says it's an eyesore. What's an eyesore? Roy had set his fork down carefully, keeping his voice even, because getting angry at a 10-year-old's report of schoolyard cruelty never actually helped the 10-year-old. It means something ugly to look at, he said. But Lily, look at me. That truck isn't ugly. It's got history. Your grandpa drove that truck to work every single day for 30 years to put food on our table, way before you were even a thought in anybody's head. It brought your mama home from the hospital the day you were born. Some things matter more than how shiny they look, kiddo. You remember that. But it makes people make fun of me, Lily said quietly, and that was the part that actually cost Roy something, more than any Hoa letter ever had. Because a man could absorb an endless supply of a rich neighbor's condescension without it touching him. But watching that same condescension land on his daughter's shoulders was a different weight entirely. He didn't sell the truck. He wanted to be clear with himself about that. Even in his hardest moments, it was never really about the truck. But he did start parking it in the garage more often after that conversation instead of the driveway. Not out of shame, exactly. More out of a tired unwillingness to keep handing his daughter's classmates more ammunition than they already had. It wasn't a decision that sat easily with him. Roy had spent 14 years learning that backing down from things that mattered, even small things, had a way of costing more in the long run than standing your ground did. And some nights, lying awake listening to the house settle the way old houses do, he turned the question over more than he liked to admit. He wasn't backing down for himself. He told himself that clearly, repeatedly, the way a man tells himself something he needs to believe. He was doing it so his daughter could walk into that school building without one more thing to defend. And there was a difference, he decided, between surrender and simply choosing your battles for someone else's sake instead of your own pride. He tried, in the weeks after that dinner conversation, to find small ways to make it right with Lily without making a production of it. He started picking her up from school himself on Fridays, instead of letting her ride the bus, parking 2 streets over where the truck wouldn't draw attention, and the two of them would walk the last stretch together, Lily narrating her week the whole way, and Roy learned to treasure those short walks more than almost anything else in his calendar. He also, quietly, without telling her, spent one whole Saturday teaching Lily how the truck's engine actually worked, walking her through the carburetor and the timing belt and the small stubborn quirks of a machine that had outlived 3 decades of newer, shinier vehicles that had already been junked and forgotten. Hoping that if she understood what was actually under that rusted hood, the insults from her classmates might start to sound a little smaller in her ears. It seemed to help. Some. Not all the way, but some. Bradford Ellery, of course, noticed the truck disappearing into the garage and took it as a personal victory, mentioning it to Diane with no small satisfaction that his persistent notices had finally gotten through to the man. A conclusion that was, like most of Bradford's conclusions about Roy Sutton, entirely wrong. The Hoe held its annual fall meeting on the second Thursday of October in the clubhouse at the end of the street, a building with a chandelier that Bradford had personally lobbied for 2 years to get installed. And Roy attended these meetings the same way he attended most obligations he found tedious but necessary, punctually. Quietly, and with every intention of leaving the moment business concluded. That particular Thursday, however, Bradford had an agenda item he'd apparently been saving up. "There's the matter," Bradford said, standing at the small podium in a blazer that cost more than Roy's truck's last 3 repairs combined, of vehicles that continue to violate our community aesthetic standards, even when garaged, given that they are still visible during loading and unloading. "I'd like to propose a formal fine structure for repeat violations." He didn't say Roy's name. He didn't need to. Every head in that room turned, at least briefly, toward the man sitting quietly in the 3rd row in a flannel shirt with grease still faintly visible under 2 of his fingernails. And Roy felt the particular heat of being discussed in the 3rd person while sitting in plain view. A feeling he remembered well from another life, another set of rooms, another kind of judgment entirely. "With respect," said an older woman named Carol Pemberton, who lived 2 doors down from Roy and had known him longer than most of the room. "I don't think a truck a man uses to get to work is really an aesthetic violation, Bradford. Some of us remember when every driveway on this street had something like it." "Times change," Carol, Bradford said, in the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. "Standards should rise to meet them." A younger homeowner near the back, a man named Todd Ashworth, who had moved in only the previous spring and clearly wanted very badly to be seen agreeing with Bradford, raised his hand and added that he'd actually had a potential buyer for his own house mention the truck during a walkthrough. An anecdote that struck Roy as suspiciously convenient, but that several heads around the room nodded along to anyway. The particular nodding of people who wanted to believe a story because it was easier than questioning it. "I think," Bradford went on, warming to the moment now that he had at least one visible ally, "that a graduated fine schedule sends the right message. $100 for a first violation in a given quarter, $200 for a second, and so on. Fair, transparent, and entirely within our rights under Section 4 of the bylaws." Carol Pemberton wasn't finished. "And what exactly counts as a violation, Bradford?" "The man drives it to work. Are we fining him for having a job?" "We're fining him," Bradford said, a slight edge creeping into his usual smooth tone now, "for choosing not to maintain a standard the rest of us have all invested significantly in maintaining." Roy said nothing through any of it. He'd learned, a long time ago, that explaining himself to a man who had already decided the verdict rarely changed the outcome, and he had exactly zero interest in making his daughter's schoolyard situation worse by turning himself into the topic of neighborhood gossip for a second consecutive month. He sat. He listened. Hands loosely folded. The same steady stillness that had once calmed frightened young soldiers, now simply calming a room full of people arguing about a truck. And when the vote finally came, he raised his hand against the proposed fine structure, along with about a third of the room, and he went home without staying for the coffee and cookies afterward the way he usually did, not out of anger exactly, more out of a tiredness that had settled somewhere behind his ribs and didn't lift the whole walk back. He did not know, walking back to his small house that night under a sky just beginning to cool into autumn, that in 11 days his entire relationship with Bradford Ellery and with the whole of Chestnut Ridge Lane was about to be rewritten by a name he hadn't heard spoken out loud in 6 years. That name was Grant. Grant Ellery was 29 years old, Bradford and Diane's only son. A fact that Bradford mentioned with considerable pride at every opportunity. Grant, who had gone to the right college, who had briefly, to Bradford's initial and vocal dismay, enlisted in the army instead of going straight into finance the way Bradford had always assumed he would, who had served 2 deployments overseas before coming home, being discharged with an injury to his left leg that still gave him a faint limp on cold mornings, and settling 3 states away where he worked, somewhat to his father's continued confusion, as a high school history teacher instead of anything involving mergers. Grant visited his parents twice a year, typically Thanksgiving and a long weekend sometime in the spring. And his visit that particular October was a surprise even to Bradford and Diane, prompted by a teaching conference 2 hours away that Grant had decided, at the last minute, to extend into a few extra days at his childhood home. He arrived on a Friday evening, and the first full day of his visit, a Saturday, he decided to take a walk down Chestnut Ridge Lane the way he had 100 times as a boy. Partly out of nostalgia, and partly because his physical therapist had told him walking was good for the leg. He was 3 houses past his parents' place when he stopped dead in the middle of the sidewalk, staring at a garage with its door raised for airing out, at the unmistakable rust-freckled tailgate of a 1978 Ford pickup truck visible just inside it, and at the man crouched beside it, wiping down a wrench with a shop rag. Grant Ellery had not seen that truck in 6 years. But he had seen it exactly once before, on the worst day of his life, parked impossibly, absurdly, in a memory he had turned over 10,000 times since nowhere near any street at all, 4,000 miles from Chestnut Ridge Lane, in a photograph a fellow soldier had once shown him of a stateside garage the man kept talking about getting back to. And more than the truck, Grant recognized the man. Sergeant Sutton? Roy looked up, wrench still in hand, and for a long moment simply stared. Because the last time he had seen this particular young man's face, it had been streaked with blood and dust and fear, and Roy had been half carrying, half dragging him across 60 yards of open ground, with bullets kicking up dirt on either side of them, praying in the specific wordless way a person prays when there's no time for actual words. Just get him there. Just get him there. Just get him there. Ellery, Roy said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. Grant Ellery. My God, what followed, over the next several minutes on that quiet suburban sidewalk, was the kind of reunion that doesn't have a script. 2 men who had shared the worst afternoon of both their lives standing frozen for a moment before Grant crossed the remaining distance and grabbed Roy in an embrace so sudden and so fierce that Roy nearly dropped his wrench entirely. Both of them saying each other's names like they still couldn't quite believe it. Both of them fighting the same wet-eyed disbelief that comes from finding, alive and well and impossibly nearby, someone you'd spent years assuming you'd only ever see again, in memory. I looked for you, Grant said, pulling back finally, gripping Roy by both forearms like he needed the physical proof that this was really happening. For years, Roy, every reunion, every unit contact list I could get my hands on. Guys told me you'd gotten out, that you'd gone quiet, nobody seemed to know where. I even hired somebody once, a guy who does that kind of search professionally, and he came back empty after a month. I thought his voice caught, and he shook his head, laughing through it in the disbelieving way people laugh when they don't know what else to do with an emotion that large. I thought, maybe you didn't want to be found. I understood that, if that was it. Some guys don't want to be found. I was never going to push. Wasn't hiding from you, son, Roy said. Wasn't hiding from anybody. Just wanted quiet. Wanted a shop, a kid to raise, a street where nobody asked me to explain myself every day. Didn't occur to me in 100 years that quiet would put me 3 houses down from your own father. He talks about you, Grant said. Not you specifically. Obviously, he has no idea who you are. But he talks about the truck. Constantly, every single Thanksgiving. I used to just tune it out, figured it was some neighbor dispute, didn't think twice about it. He laughed again, shakier this time. I can't believe the truck he's been complaining about for years is your truck. Your dad's truck. The one from the picture. You remember that picture? I showed everybody that picture, Grant said. Told the whole platoon about the sergeant who talked about getting home to his old truck like it was the finest car ever built. I used to think about that conversation a lot, after, wondering if you made it back to it. Made it back, Roy said quietly. Every day since. 6 years earlier, in a stretch of country Roy still couldn't discuss in much detail even now, his unit had been moving through a narrow stretch of road just after sunrise, the kind of morning that started ordinary and stayed ordinary right up until the exact second it stopped being ordinary at all. Roy remembered the light that morning more than almost anything else about it. A flat pale gold coming up over low hills. And he remembered thinking, in the brief useless way a mind sometimes wanders even on duty, that it looked almost exactly like a morning back home. Then the road had erupted, and the ambush that followed killed 2 men outright and left 6 others wounded. Grant Ellery among them. A piece of shrapnel tearing through the meat of his thigh and dropping him hard into open ground, with no cover in any direction. Roy, then a staff sergeant with 14 years in, a man other soldiers trusted precisely because he never seemed to panic, even when panic would have been the reasonable response, heard Grant's voice among the chaos. A young private's voice pitched high with pain and fear. Calling out in the particular way a person calls out when they've stopped believing anyone is coming. And something in Roy simply moved before the rest of him finished deciding to. He went out into that open ground anyway, under fire, because a 23-year-old private was lying out there bleeding, and Roy was not going to let that be the end of the story if there was anything at all he could do about it. He remembered the specific weight of Grant against his shoulder as he half-carried, half-dragged him back toward the tree line, remembered the sound the ground made kicking up in small, violent bursts on either side of them. Remembered praying in the wordless way a person prays when there's no time left over for actual words. Just get him there. Just get him there. Just get him there. He'd gotten Grant back behind cover, applied a tourniquet with hands that he later couldn't quite remember functioning that steadily, and kept him talking. Kept him conscious, kept him alive through the 26 minutes it took for a medevac to reach them. 26 minutes that both men remembered with a clarity neither had ever fully been able to shake. Roy talked to him the entire time about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. Asked him about home, about his parents, about a girl Grant had been seeing before deployment. Anything at all to keep those young eyes open and fixed on Roy's face, instead of drifting toward the sky the way wounded men's eyes sometimes drifted when the body started giving up before the mind was ready to let it. Roy had carried the weight of that morning differently than most of what he carried home from those years. It wasn't a memory that visited him often, not the way some memories visited other men he'd served with, but it lived in him permanently all the same. Folded quietly into the same part of himself that had learned, a long time ago, that a calm voice and a steady hand could sometimes matter more than any weapon a man carried. Roy had received a silver star for that day, a fact he had never once mentioned to a single soul on Chestnut Ridge Lane in 11 years of living there. Because Roy Sutton did not consider what he'd done that day heroic so much as simply necessary. The only thing a decent man could have done in that moment, and he had never seen much use in wearing a story like that around like decoration. The medal itself sat in a small wooden box on the top shelf of his bedroom closet, wrapped in the same cloth his late wife had wrapped it in the week it arrived, and Roy took it down perhaps twice a year. On quiet nights he didn't discuss with anyone, including his own daughter. Grant, for his part, had spent 6 years trying, on and off, without much success, to track down the sergeant who'd carried him out of that field, only to be told each time by old Army contacts that Sutton had left the service and, as far as anyone could tell, dropped fully off the map into private life somewhere. He had never imagined, not once in any of his searching, that the man was living 3 houses down from his own parents' front porch the entire time, hidden behind nothing more than an unassuming little house and an old truck his father found personally offensive. "You've been here," Grant said, still gripping Roy by both shoulders like he needed the physical confirmation that this was real. "You've been living 3 houses from my parents this whole time?" 11 years, Roy said. "Didn't have the first idea Bradford Ellery was your father until this exact second, son. I promise you that." Grant laughed, a startled, disbelieving laugh with tears still standing in his eyes. "My dad." "Roy, my dad has been sending you ho-oh notices about your truck for years. He's called that truck an eyesore to my face at Thanksgiving more than once." Roy managed a small, tired smile. Wouldn't be the first time a man judged a book by a rusty cover. Grant insisted, right then, on walking Roy back to his parents' house, and Bradford Ellery, hearing voices on the front porch and coming out to investigate, found himself facing a scene he had absolutely no framework to process his son, home for a surprise visit, standing arm in arm with the very neighbor Bradford had spent a decade complaining about, both men's faces streaked with something that looked, unmistakably, like unshed tears. "Dad," Grant said, and his voice had a weight in it Bradford had rarely heard from his son. Not since the day Grant had first told him, at 20 years old, that he'd decided to enlist instead of following the path Bradford had quietly always assumed for him. "This is Sergeant Roy Sutton. This is the man who carried me out of an ambush zone under direct fire 6 years ago and kept me alive for 26 minutes until a medevac reached us. This is the reason I came home to you at all. Bradford Ellery, a man who had built an entire second career out of having a confident opinion on absolutely everything, found himself, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, entirely without words. He started and stopped. He looked at Roy, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time in 11 years of living 3 houses apart, past the flannel shirt and the grease-stained knuckles, and the old truck he'd spent a decade complaining about in writing, and something in his face began, slowly, to rearrange itself. "You saved Grant's life?" "I did what any of us would have done," Roy said quietly. "He's a good soldier. Was a good soldier. Good man now, from what I understand. He received a Silver Star for it," Grant said, when Roy didn't elaborate further, because Grant had spent 6 years wanting someone in his father's orbit to understand exactly what kind of man had been living 3 houses down the whole time. "One of the highest honors this country gives out, Dad, and you've been sending him letters about his truck." Diane Ellery, who had come out onto the porch behind her husband and heard most of this exchange, pressed a hand over her mouth, and Bradford, 63 years old, a man who had never in his life apologized for an opinion he considered correct, found himself standing on his own front porch, fighting to find words adequate to the moment. and failing rather badly at it. Which was, Diane would say later, the single most humbling thing she had ever watched happen to her husband in 36 years of marriage. "I owe you an apology," Bradford finally managed. I judged you. I judged you badly, and for a long time, over something that never should have mattered in the first place, and I did it without ever once asking who you actually were. I'm ashamed of that, Roy. I mean that. Bradford, Diane said quietly from the doorway, a gentle warning in her voice, though whether she was warning her husband to keep going or warning him not to make it worse, Roy honestly couldn't tell. Bradford pressed on anyway, visibly working to find his footing in unfamiliar territory. I sent you 14 notices about that truck. 14. I want you to know I counted them. Once Grant told me who you were, I went back through my files last night. Because some part of me needed to see the number in writing, needed to understand exactly how small-minded I'd been for exactly how long. 14 letters about paint and rust, Roy, while you were living 3 houses down carrying something I can't even properly imagine. You didn't know, Roy said, and there was no bitterness in it, only the plain, tired patience of a man who had genuinely never held the grudge Bradford seemed to be trying to atone for. That's the whole point of judging a book by its cover, Bradford. You never know what's actually inside until somebody hands you a reason to look. I never gave you a reason. Wasn't your job to go looking for one uninvited? I should have asked, Bradford said. Just once, in 11 years, I should have knocked on your door and asked who you were instead of deciding I already knew. Maybe, Roy allowed. Or maybe some things only get told when the timing's right, and the timing wasn't right till your own son happened to walk down this street on the one Saturday I had the garage door up. Man doesn't get to control that kind of thing. I've made my peace with a lot of things I couldn't control. This is just one more. Apology accepted, Roy said, because he was not a man who held grudges for their own sake, and because whatever satisfaction there might have been in making Bradford Ellery squirm a little longer simply wasn't in him. Truck's still ugly, though. I'll give you that much. The laugh that broke out on that porch, shaky and relieved, and a little disbelieving, was the sound of 11 years of quiet tension finally cracking loose all at once. Word moved through Chestnut Ridge Lane the way word always does, quietly at first, then everywhere at once, and by the following week half the street knew some version of the story that the man in the little house with the old truck, the one Bradford Ellery had spent a decade filing hoe complaints against, had once carried Bradford's own son across an open field under enemy fire and kept him alive with his bare hands and a tourniquet until help arrived. Carol Pemberton, who had defended Roy at that fall meeting without knowing a fraction of the real story, stopped by with a pie and told Roy, with no small satisfaction of her own, that she'd always had a feeling about him, though she was honest enough to admit she hadn't had that particular feeling. Todd Ashworth, the younger homeowner who'd spoken up in support of Bradford's fine proposal that fall, came by the shop in person a week later, visibly uncomfortable, to apologize for the walk-through comment he'd made up about a potential buyer, admitting sheepishly that there had never actually been any such buyer. That he'd simply wanted to be agreeable in a room where Bradford's opinion had always seemed to carry the most weight. Roy accepted the apology the same way he accepted most things, without making the other man work harder for forgiveness than he needed to, though he did suggest, with a small dry smile, that Todd might consider forming his own opinions a little more independently going forward. A suggestion Todd took, by all later accounts, genuinely to heart. Even the Ho-Oh newsletter, typically a dry bulletin of lawn care reminders and pool schedule updates, ran a short unsigned note the following month acknowledging an oversight in how the association previously characterized a resident's personal property. A sentence so carefully lawyered that Roy laughed out loud the first time he read it, showing it to Grant with the observation that some habits, evidently, died harder than others, ho or no ho. At the next HOA meeting, held the following month, Bradford Ellery stood at the podium he'd once used to propose fines against Roy's truck, and instead proposed something else entirely: a small plaque, to be installed at the entrance to Chestnut Ridge Lane, honoring the veterans who lived on the street, with Roy Sutton's name listed first. A proposal that passed unanimously, including Roy's own reluctant vote, cast only after his daughter Lily leaned over and whispered that he absolutely had to vote yes or she would never forgive him. Lily's classmates, too, heard the story eventually, the way stories travel through a school faster than any adult ever manages, and Madison Ellery Bradford's granddaughter. Grant's niece found Lily at recess one day not long after and told her, a little sheepishly, that her grandpa had told the whole family what Lily's dad had really done, and that the truck wasn't an eyesore at all, it was actually the coolest thing on the whole street, and did Lily maybe want to sit together at lunch sometime. Lily came home that afternoon, lighter than Roy had seen her in months, dropping her backpack by the door and launching into a full recounting of the conversation before she'd even taken her shoes off. And Roy stood in the kitchen, listening to his daughter talk with her whole chest again, no longer picking at her words the careful way she'd been picking at them all fall. And he found himself, not for the first time that week, having to turn back to the stove for a moment so she wouldn't see his eyes go wet over something as simple as watching her be a kid again. Bradford, for his part, did not stop at the plaque. Over the following months he found himself, almost against his own long-standing instincts, seeking out reasons to walk down to Roy's end of the street. First with genuine questions about the truck's engine that he asked, with the stiff formality of a man unused to admitting he didn't already know something, and later simply because he'd discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he enjoyed Roy's company more than he enjoyed almost anyone else's on Chestnut Ridge Lane. He brought Roy a bottle of good bourbon one evening, not as an apology exactly, since he'd already made that, but as what he called, a little awkwardly, a gesture between neighbors who ought to have known each other better a long time ago, and Roy accepted it graciously and did not point out, though he thought about it, that a bottle of bourbon was a considerably more generous gesture than 14 HOA notices had ever been. Diane, too, found herself changed by the whole affair in ways she hadn't expected. She began stopping by more often, sometimes with a dish she'd made too much of, sometimes just to sit on Roy's porch for 20 minutes and talk about nothing important, and she told Roy once, quietly, that watching her husband apologize on that porch had been the proudest she'd felt of him in years, prouder even than the day he'd made partner at his old firm. Because an apology like that, freely given by a man who rarely gave them, meant something a promotion never could. There was a harder day, too, one Roy didn't talk about much afterward, when Grant asked him, sitting in that same garage some weeks later, whether he ever had trouble sleeping, whether the memory of that morning ever came back, uninvited the way memories sometimes do for men who'd carried what Roy had carried. Roy answered him honestly, the way he tried to answer most things honestly with a young man he now considered something close to a son, admitting that, yes, some nights, it did, that the sound of the ground kicking up dust sometimes found its way into ordinary noises, a car backfiring, a door slamming harder than intended, and that he'd learned, slowly over years, to sit with it rather than fight it, and that talking to someone, even now, even this long after, still helped more than most men were willing to admit it did. Grant nodded at that, quiet for a long moment, and told Roy he'd started seeing someone himself, a counselor 2 towns from where he taught, and that it was slowly helping him too. It was a small exchange, unremarkable to anyone who might have overheard it, but it mattered enormously to both of them. Two men trading honesty instead of the careful silences veterans sometimes settle for instead. Down at the shop, Desmond took the whole story about as well as anyone could have predicted. Which was to say, he brought it up constantly, told every single customer who'd listen, and eventually printed out a second, laminated copy of the newspaper article to keep at his own register station, informing Roy that working for a man who'd earned a silver star and still let him leave early on Fridays to visit his grandmother was, in his professional 22-year-old opinion, basically the best job in America. Old Mrs. Fenwick, for her part, declared that she had personally suspected all along that Roy was some kind of hero, a claim Roy gently disputed every single time she made it, though he noticed she kept making it anyway, undeterred by his modesty. Right up through the following Christmas when her preserves arrived with a handwritten card that simply read, "Proud to know you, Sergeant." Roy still drives that same 1978 Ford, still rebuilt with his own two hands, still parked in the driveway most mornings instead of hidden away in the garage. Because there is no longer any reason to hide it. Bradford Ellery, these days, has been known to wave at the truck when he sees it, sometimes even walking down to lean against the tailgate and talk with Roy for a while about nothing in particular. Two men who spent a decade as strangers 3 houses apart finally becoming, slowly, something like friends. Grant visits more often now, drawn back not just by his parents, but by a man he considers something closer to family, and some Saturday mornings you'll find him in that garage with Roy, handing him wrenches, listening to stories about a father Roy rarely spoke about before there was anyone around who understood exactly what those stories cost to tell. There was one more evening, quieter than the rest, that Roy thought about often in the months that followed. A few days after Grant's reveal, once the initial flood of neighborhood attention had settled into something more manageable, Roy sat Lily down on his bed and, for the first time in her 10 years of life, took the small wooden box down from the closet shelf and opened it in front of her. Lily went very still looking at it, the same stillness Roy recognized from the diner counter kind of moments, the stillness of a child sensing something large without yet having words for it. "Is that a real medal?" she asked, barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might somehow damage it. "It's called a silver star," Roy told her, lifting it carefully from its cloth. "They don't give these out for nothing, baby. And they don't give them out for everything, either. Just for the days a person did something that mattered more than being scared mattered." "Were you scared? When you saved Mr. Grant?" "More scared than I've ever been in my whole life," Roy admitted, because he had promised himself a long time ago that he would never lie to his daughter about the hard things, only choose carefully when to tell her about them. "Being brave isn't about not being scared, Lily. It's about doing the right thing anyway, even with the scared still sitting right there in your chest the whole time." Lily reached out one finger, hesitant, and touched the edge of the medal like she needed to confirm it was really solid, really real, really her father's. "Why didn't you ever show me before?" Roy considered the question a long moment before answering, because it deserved a real answer and not a quick one. "I didn't want you growing up thinking your dad was somebody different than the dad you actually had," he said finally. "I didn't want you comparing the everyday version of me, the one who burns the toast some mornings and can't ever find his own car keys, to some story in a box. I wanted you to know me as your dad first. Figured the rest could come later, when you were old enough to understand it didn't replace the everyday part. Just adds to it." Lily thought about that for a while. In the serious 10-year-old way she thought about most things that actually mattered to her, and then she leaned her head against his shoulder and said, simply, "I like both parts. The everyday dad and this dad. I think they're the same person anyway. Yeah, Roy said, closing the box gently and setting it back on the shelf, though this time he left the closet door open a little wider than before. I think they are too. Bradford eventually asked Roy, one quiet evening on that same front porch, why he'd never told anyone, not once in 11 years, about the silver star sitting wrapped in cloth on his closet shelf. Roy thought about it a long moment before answering. Medals don't make a man decent, he said. They just prove he was decent on one particular bad day. I try to be the same man on all the other days too. Medal or no medal. Didn't figure the truck needed explaining. Didn't figure I did either. Bradford Ellery, a man who had spent a career believing that worth could be measured, priced, and displayed, found himself thinking about that sentence for a long time afterward, in a way he never quite managed to put fully into words, except to say, quietly to his wife one night over coffee, that he suspected he had a great deal left to learn about the difference between what a man owns and what a man actually is. News of the plaque dedication reached beyond Chestnut Ridge Lane by the following spring, when the town's small local paper ran a short piece on it timed to Memorial Day. A reporter named Julia Fenn, having heard the story secondhand from someone at the hardware store and tracked it down to its source. Roy agreed to the interview only reluctantly, and only after Lily, who had by then appointed herself his unofficial publicist on the matter, informed him that refusing to talk about it would be, in her words, extremely unfair to everyone who wants to know a true good thing happened for once. The article ran with a small photograph of Roy standing beside his truck, Lily next to him with her arms crossed in solidarity, and the headline read simply, "The neighbor nobody knew." Old Mrs. Fenwick brought 3 jars of peach preserves to the shop the week the article ran instead of her usual one, informing Roy with great seriousness that this was hazard pay for putting up with people's nonsense for 11 years, and Desmond taped a copy of the article up behind the register, where it stayed for the rest of the year despite Roy asking him twice to take it down. Priya Anand stopped by the shop specifically to tell Roy that her own late father had served, and that reading the article had made her cry at her kitchen table before work, and that she was grateful, in a way she found hard to fully articulate, that a story like Roy's had found its way into the world after all. The town itself held a small Memorial Day ceremony that year at the little park near the library, the kind of modest gathering with folding chairs and a local Boy Scout troop presenting the colors, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Roy agreed to stand up when the veterans in attendance were asked to be recognized. He did it, he told Grant quietly beforehand, not for himself, but because Lily had asked him to, point blank, over dinner one night, whether he'd ever stood up at one of those ceremonies before, and when he admitted he hadn't, she'd simply said, "I think you should. I want to see you stand up." A 10-year-old's request turned out to carry more weight with Roy than 11 years of Ho notices ever had. Grant stood beside him that day, and so, somewhat to the surprise of half the town, did Bradford Ellery, who had quietly arranged, through channels Roy never fully learned the details of, to have the plaque at the entrance of Chestnut Ridge Lane formally rededicated that same weekend. With a short, unpolished speech that Bradford delivered without his usual practiced smoothness, stumbling once or twice over his own words, in a way that struck everyone present as considerably more sincere than his usual polished remarks ever managed to be. "I spent a decade," Bradford said, standing at a small podium that had nothing to do with mergers or property values, measuring my neighbor by the wrong yardstick entirely. I want to publicly say that I was wrong, and that I'm grateful, more grateful than I know how to properly express, that Roy Sutton is the kind of man he is, regardless of what he happens to drive. Roy, standing in the small crowd with Lily's hand in his, felt something in his chest ease that he hadn't fully realized had been sitting tight there for 11 long years. A knot of quiet resignation he hadn't even known he'd been carrying until the moment it finally let go. Lily, for her part, used the whole saga as the subject of a school project that spring, a family history assignment her teacher had given the class, and where most of her classmates brought in old photographs or family recipes, Lily brought in her grandfather's original 1978 truck registration, a photograph of her father in uniform decades younger than the man she knew, and a hand-drawn timeline connecting a battlefield 4,000 miles away to a quiet suburban driveway, ending the whole presentation with a single sentence that her teacher later told Roy had made the entire back row of parents attending that day quietly wipe their eyes. "My dad's truck isn't ugly. It just carries things you can't see from the outside, same as him." Some of the finest things a person carries were never meant to be seen from the street. Sometimes they're rusted, sometimes they're quiet. Sometimes they're folded away in a cloth on a closet shelf, and sometimes it takes a stranger's recognition, arriving on an ordinary Saturday morning, to remind an entire street what they'd been looking at and dismissing the whole time.